Welcome back and welcome to the Körber History Forum. Welcome to our viewers on live stream Spiegel.de. Our next session takes place in cooperation with the Spiegel, and Making Peace is the title of this series of events. And we have a guest that always comes to this series of events, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, the head of the Munich Security Conference. It's a pleasure to have you here on stage again. His partner on stage will be the Marburg historian Eckart Conze, and Dirk Kurbjuweit from Spiegel is going to be the facilitator, the moderator. We are especially interested during this panel to look at the contemporary view on the Versailles Peace Treaty, and we also would like to hear about the Paris peace architecture as it was developed after 1990. And we are going to look at the international security architecture in the interwar period and why it failed. And this leads us to the question, are there any lessons we can learn from that? Having said this, I will hand over to Dirk Kurbjuweit. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much. The three of us here on stage are happy to be here and have the opportunity to discuss these issues first on stage and then during the last 20 minutes with you. Mr. Conze, let's imagine the time 100 years ago, summer 1990, Versailles has been signed by the Germans. What was the atmosphere in Europe and in the world at large? Were people relieved? Did people have hopes that this would be the starting point of a long peace period? People were relieved, and not only in summer 1919, in autumn, winter 1819, after the end of the war, people felt relieved, but they were not satisfied with the type of peace that was signed in Versailles on the 18th of June and in the months afterwards. Because the expectations coming from different societies, different states regarding this peace were different. And so all stakeholders thought that their expectations were not fulfilled, and probably they couldn't be fulfilled given the experience of the war that was started in 1914. Mr. Ischinger, how about today? Is there any discussion about Versailles in the security community? Is this a kind of monument, a place of remembrance, saying this should never happen again because Versailles was the starting point to next disaster, the next catastrophe? What about Versailles today? Well, I think when we as diplomats or politicians deal with the present or think about the future, we should try to learn the lessons from Versailles. One such lesson is, as far as I can see it, respice finem, that was something that a boss of mine used to say, think about the end. Diplomacy is bad when it just looks at the short-term goals. That is to say, for instance, subjection or reparations, that was part of the Versailles Treaty. If diplomacy just looks at reparations, it's bad. It has to think about the long-term future. Have we learned this lesson? Well, not enough as I see it. Maybe we didn't look at this very much, especially after 1989, 1990, what to do about the collapsing Soviet Union, how to treat it, how to treat the painful processes of transition that were started there. Also, in our most recent history, we lost sight of those lessons. Here I think of what we did about the Gaddafi regime 7 or 8 years ago. So thinking long term, that's important, not just seeing the short term end of a military conflict, a military dispute, thinking about a treaty ending military confrontation, thinking long term in that we should develop a stable order. And my last remark, and that's also a lesson from Versailles, my last remark is it works better when you're able, first of all, to set up rules that are firm and is respected by everyone. And secondly, it works better if we can create institutions, equipping that in those institutions in a way that everyone can accept it. We didn't succeed in doing that after the First World War. The League of Nations, for instance, was such an attempt. We succeeded in doing that in a better way, setting up the United Nations after the Second World War, but still it's not good enough because the UN was supposed to be the arbitrator, conflict preventing global organization, and unfortunately in our current present it doesn't fulfill completely its mission. So the lessons of Versailles are still there and need to be absorbed fully. Let's look at some of the aspects of the negotiations. One aspect was the Woodrow Wilson, the American president, was supposed to be the savior, so to say. He announced his 14 items during the war, and then he said that the nations must have the right to self-determination. The masses welcomed him when he arrived in Paris. Hundreds of thousands were in the streets welcoming him, and they thought, he is the savior, he is going to bring peace. And then he disappointed them. Well, first of all, he was welcomed as a savior, as the representative of a country who had massively contributed to the end of the war. And now the US were rising politically, economically, militarily. And so he was the symbol of a new world order that they wanted to create, and the US was supposed to be very important. That was the expectation, and people felt relieved since they were happy that the war was over. And then everywhere in Europe there were the demands for the nations to take their destiny in their own hands, have the right of self-determination. Nobody really knew what that meant. Even Wilson wasn't so sure about it. What is self-determination? Is that a political or ethnic term? And can the idea of national self-determination be related to certain territories? Is self-determination the same as self-government? All these were open issues that had repercussions on the course of negotiations in Paris as they were started in January 1919. And they were so complex, and they were to be applied not only to Europe, but the global order and the global south. The part of the world that was dominated imperially, there was such a time pressure, and there were so many pent-up expectations of the national, international, and global public. It was very hard to fulfill all of that, and that's the big problem. Wilson, of course, as we all know, was losing his backup in his own country, and so he could not fully implement his vision and ideas in his own country, also with regard to the League of Nations. The United States did not join the League of Nations. Mr. Ischinger, there was another savior from America a couple of years ago who was welcomed greatly, who was acclaimed. That was Barack Obama. Tens of thousands came to Tiergarten, to the Column of Victory, to Wilhelm Column of Victory, thinking that he would make the world a better place. He got the Nobel Prize for Peace before it ever even done something, and we all know that he could not fulfill these hopes. How about expectation management? Could we manage our expectations in a better way when we have somebody who seems to be so almighty? Well, I hope that the Nobel Prize Committee when awarding the Nobel Prize to Barack Obama, had certain ideas. Let's say they thought if we give the Nobel Prize for Peace to him, then he would be wearing a kind of a crown, and maybe that makes it easier for him to go against the resistance. Maybe it's easier for him to fulfill the vision. And he had rhetorically proclaimed it in a wonderful way, the famous speech in Egypt, in other places, in Europe also. And it would be easier for him to fulfill those visions with the Nobel Prize. I'm not saying that the Nobel Prize Committee didn't think about anything. I wouldn't want to say that. And let me add, I would rather prefer if a couple of people welcomed him. I was one of them welcoming Obama in Berlin. He was not even formally appointed the candidate of the Democrats. I prefer that over welcoming a candidate that would give us reason for concerns, like the president that followed Obama. And why do I prefer such an enthusiasm? I mean, I'm not a historian by profession, but I have read Heinrich August Winkler's book, The Long Way to the West, and it was a pleasure to read that book. I think for us Germans, America, or the White House, is a symbol. It's a symbol for the West in general. That at least was the symbol after the Second World War, when we started our long way towards the West. For me, my generation, the White House, the United States were a symbol. Our French and British neighbors didn't need so much a symbol, because they could rightfully say, we are the West. We do not need a new symbol for the West. We as Germans needed that symbol urgently. And that is why, if there's no Obama, no John F. Kennedy, but rather a Donald Trump, we lose the ability to see ourselves as part of the West. Where is that symbol? I see no substitute for the White House, the city on the hill. I would say the Germans, because of the things that have happened in our transatlantic relations, because of the things that are happening right now in the White House, the Germans are losing a lot. They lose much more than our French or British partners. And that, of course, is a kind of understanding of Westernness that is very closely linked to a political and military hegemony, the hegemony of the United States. And if such a hegemony declines at the end of the American century, the question is, what does happen to those ideas of Westernness that are so important in Winkler's book? If this Westernness is no longer equalized to a strong American hegemony, and that leads us back to the interwar period, where Wilson's vision was followed by a withdrawal. At least when the global economic crisis started, they conducted a policy of isolationism that gave rise to non-Western anti-liberal ideas everywhere in Europe, including the Weimar Republic. That is also the question we need to raise today, because it's relevant for the present. Maybe that is a threatening parallel. You said the Americans withdrew, left the Europeans to their own devices, and we all know where this led to. It led it right into a world war. Today we see similar tendencies. What do you think about that, Mr. Ischinger? Is that a threat? Is it a threat? And does the West need a leader that guides the West? And if there is no such leader around anymore, there's the danger of chaos unfolding and a new war emerging. I think indeed, like Professor Conze said, the American withdrawal meant that all the hopes were crushed, all expectations were crushed. People had hoped that a peace order would emerge, but the moment the Americans withdrew, there was confrontation again in Europe. Now, if we say, once again, we have a historical withdrawal of the United States, we do not know whether Trump's way of doing politics will prevail, but let's say it would prevail. Let's say the American voters want him to go on the way he does right now. Then we would have a dramatic difference still between the old days and today. Namely, today we do have a chance, we do have an opportunity to take this identity, those values of the West, to use this role that the West has in order to continue to develop a united Europe. At that time, there was just confrontation in Europe. There was no such thing as a European Union. So the question is quite a brave one, and I'm not so confident that we will really make it happen, but we must at least give it a try. Should the United States really withdraw, we must try to keep up the unity of 500 million Europeans. Right now, they are members of the European Union, a community of values, and we should try to keep up those values, even though we might no longer have the support of a hegemonial power like the United States. I think at least that's an opportunity, that's a chance we have, and we better use it. And of course, this chance today is much more realistic than it used to be in the 20s or 30s.
One of my favorite words is obligatory clause, and you can use that in the early New Age. It was used in peace treaties in Utrecht, for example. So we forget what it was and we'll start new. So you just forgive and forget, because that is the big basis for a new start, and that's what they so there is no obligatory clause. You say the Germans are at fault, and only the Germans are at fault with this war, and that had drastic consequence in Germany that felt humiliated. What do you think? What about such a clause? Would that have been able to avert Versailles? Well, that's a theoretical question. So under the conditions of the war and the experience of the war, so with millions of victims, it wasn't imaginable to forgive and forget in the traditional sense. So, but that time was just over, so there was really, there was no chance. And of course the behavior of the Germans in Versailles actually contributed to the fact that so that it was charged morally right up to the Article 231 of Versailles, so that no one could think of this, that for instance, to come to a status for quo ante. So, and that is connected, and that's interesting, because there's also a connection to the present day. So there was the first attempts, but that failed, then of transitional justice, of the trying to look at war criminals and war crime and then punish them individually for their action, but that failed because they leave it to the Germans in the early 20s. So that's the lesson that they draw in 1944 and 1945, and that leads to Nuremberg. And in a certain sense, this idea of not forgiving, not forgetting, and an individual criminal justice responsibility, only in the 90s, in the context of Yugoslavia, ICTY, but also in the negotiations about the Roman statutes and ICC, this when they're picked up again. So forgive and forget under the conditions of modern public and dynamism of modern public, it is more difficult than ever before. So it's really impossible in the transitional justice research. It's a big issue, of course. Reconciliation committees, truth committees on the one hand, and then international law pursuing criminal acts on the other hand. So the ambivalence and the tension is still with us in various discussions. Right, and would it not be sensible in certain cases to go back to the oblivion clause? And don't they still do that in Afghanistan, for instance, where they said, okay, with the Taliban, we're not going to sit around the table with the Taliban, no peace order with the Taliban. And now they have said, okay, well, maybe the Taliban should be included, the new order. So what about Assad in Syria? And that's also they blocked a solution for longer. So actually the idea is unbearable that with a person like Assad, who is slaughtering his own people, is to make peace with them and to leave some of his power. But sometimes you have to do it so at least to achieve peace then. Well, so let's take a step back. So I think the example of Bashar Assad in Syria is very interesting, and from the point of view of the practicing diplomat. So I believe that it's, so I would agree completely with you, and when you say, okay, that idea is unbearable, that with this figure, sort of then return to business as usual. So, but the mistake is, like 6 or 7 years ago, as I see it, as a Western leader, and you can look at German political leaders as are no exception to that. So Western leaders, as I find, are pretty lax and pretty negligent even. So that's very bad diplomacy that they said Assad needs to go. So that was very popular then, right? So every other speech said Assad needs to go. And then when you ask them, okay, tell me, and let's assume we get them away, get rid of him, but regardless of how, what then? Have we got a plan? Have we got a responsible plan of what will happen then in this country? So who's going to do what? And who is supposed to, what role are the Syrians going to play? And so I would say, looking back, so also self-critically for the entire Western community, no one had a proper plan. So they just said he needs to go. So that's why it's all the more embarrassing when now we are in a situation, or we would be in a situation where, for reasons of realpolitik, we would have to say, okay, now this guy is still in power, we didn't get rid of him, now we have to somehow handle him. So that's why I think the big mistake was made in the past. So when they said things like get rid of Assad without knowing how to turn that into reality, and without knowing, once you've taken the first step, how to take the second step. So that's why I can only warn against such regime change claims and demands spoken so readily. You should consider that very carefully, and that's why I'm concerned too when nowadays when I hear things like this from certain Washington circles, that for my ears sounds like as if there were people thinking about regime change once more in a form that is didn't consider the end properly. So when the era of realpolitik, so what about historians' view? Well, regime change, when you look at 1918, 1919, this is what happened. And so it's not difficult to say it, but it means, what does it mean? Always consider the end. So what does it mean for the further development of Germany in the Weimar Republic, as well as European context with regard to the German and French relationship? So regime change is one thing. That's the condition that the armistice is coupled in November 1918. But what's the result of this? There's no consensus about how to deal with the changing regime in Germany, so in the emerging Weimar Republic, of which you don't know beforehand at the beginning of 1919 how it's going to develop and whether it's going to be stabilized politically at all. So regime change as a short-term political option is too short-termed if you don't think of long-term strategies, and it's not to connect with long-term strategy. But we didn't have that in 1919, and especially there was no consensus between the Allies about such long-term strategy. And in the French case, this was primarily targeted, and understandably so, to security against Germany once and for all, and also American Wilson's consideration of an institutional securing of the peace, collective security, also including the German war enemy after the regime change. But that kind of like confronted one another, and that's one of the reasons why the Germans were not invited to Paris at all. So they know right away that they're going to drive a spear into the differences in opinion of the Allies, and they couldn't develop long-term consensus, and that's why you've got the peace conditions of May 1919. That's a precarious compromise amongst the Allies, which the Germans are not involved at all, because they would actually identify this as a precarious compromise right away. So now there's a subject which hurts me as a journalist a little bit. There's the role of the public, and the other big peace conference was the one in Vienna, the Vienna Conference in 1814, 1815, and to a large extent it was secret diplomacy, and there was closed doors. Diplomats, counts and kings agreed in a closed-off room, and this did not happen in Paris. Wilson didn't want this. He didn't want to have the secret diplomacy, which he thought was disadvantageous, because that had led to the First World War. So the journalists are there, and they report daily, and this creates something new. We've got a feedback from the public in the respective countries. So this actually puts under pressure. What do you think? At the end of the day, was there damage to the result, or did it benefit them? So what's the role of the public then? Well, I'm far from describing the Vienna Congress as a model of a rational peace agreement. So I mean, the players in 1918, 1919, that was exactly the case. So there was thick volumes about the Vienna Congress as kind of like instructions and guidance for action of 1919. But so there's not just looking at the media public, but also the emerging democratic public, also in the Western countries, of totally different conditions, also of international policy than 100 years before. So there's no way back, and Wilson makes it more than clear. And it's not just the press and the media, it's about election campaigns that take place in the UK, in Great Britain and the USA in that time, on the background of the negotiations. And you need to connect that once more with the argument that the end of the war just a few weeks back, and war experience, and also the expectations of peace on the background of this war, which was translated one-on-one into the election campaigns. And so the election campaigns also have an impact on the negotiations, and the players are under a permanent pressure of justification as to their domestic public. And the experience and the wealth of experience with public and media public, and also in this constellation at the end of the World War One, that didn't exist. So there's also learning at the end, also learning by trial and error. So a learning in the peace, or in the process of making peace, dealing with such public and also public opinions and, of course, very high-flying emotions. So there's no experience there. There's nothing. So Vienna is like 100 years ago, and there's nothing that you could latch on to and you couldn't learn. And this has an impact, and not just on the side of the winners, but also on the side of the losers. Not just the German Empire, but also the other loser societies. That has a massive impact on the peace agreement and also the acceptance of peace agreement. At the end of the day, all expectations are not fulfilled. So not just the dissatisfaction with the contract. I mean, on the loser side, it's not just any bigger than on the loser side. So after a few weeks after this signature under the agreement, there's no one who seriously defends these agreements and these contracts and would adopt this peace agreement. So this goes far beyond the German critics, and in Keynes in Great Britain and in France and Italy, the Prime Minister's Nitti, who actually signed the agreement himself, will distance himself within a short period of time. So, and obviously this has something to do with the pressure of expectation, so the media, the public, so that you don't have a chance at all to have a stable and long-term stable and accepted peace under these conditions. So perverted public, and that's the we know that also from Trump and his peace talks with Kim Jong-un. He prepares that with Twitter, and then there's a big meeting at hotels, and it's just a pure staging where at the end of the day you don't achieve anything or very little. Do you believe that Twitter is a procedure for diplomacy which will lead to which may lead to peace? Is this just a this is just going astray, as in history? Well, I've got two hearts beating in my chest there. So, on the one hand, I'm thinking of from the point of view of the diplomat who has to lead negotiations, and of course, we've got a certain interest that such negotiations are to conducted without the public or confidentially and maybe secretly. So I could sympathize with the negotiators of the EU when it was about negotiations with TTIP, and in our public there was the call, we want to understand every single step and in the public. So that is not a very good recipe, I believe, in order to achieve success in negotiations. So and when the other side also has will discuss motives and alternatives, and we'll learn about that from the press. So I believe that for successful negotiations, it's important to have a certain degree of confidentiality or secrecy. And but now the second point, the second aspect is that as things are today, and Mr. Conze already said, there's a development from the Vienna process to the process of Versailles, and that just continues, and nothing will remain secret. So if maybe in 1919 there was maybe certain channels in the back room, today this is not secret. At the end of the day, it'll be published in the New Yorker, on the FAZ, the German Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, or the Spiegel. Yes, oh, Spiegel, sure. Well, I didn't want to. I thought you were the neutral mediator here. Anyway, so in other words, the negotiator today will need to behave in such a manner in his negotiations that he can live with it. So he shouldn't commit political suicide by saying something in the negotiations, trusting on confidentiality, but knowing that possibly the opponent or someone else will disclose it tomorrow or the day after tomorrow in Twitter or on Spiegel or whatever. So the public cannot be ruled out completely. So with everything you say and you do, you suggest and you reject, you need to be clear on the fact that this may be in the public domain the day after tomorrow. Can I actually possibly also explain and defend that with a good conscience? Admittedly, so such diplomatic and international negotiations are a bit more complicated than at a time like, I don't know, 1814, where probably there were certain negotiations that you could have without somebody taking notes, or somebody directly after 10 seconds would send out the first Twitter message. And that's the way it is today. So if I may add, so you can take that argument further, not just the question of confidentiality and secrecy, of negotiations and practices of whistleblowing and leaking, and that was already practiced in 1919, mind you. So, but is it possible, so under these conditions, also to have certain two sets of keys that you can use? So you've got the French politics, for instance, on the one hand. You've got this awful scene at the 28th of June 1919 in Versailles, when the German delegation comes to the French, they march by Girl Cassé, who's facially disfigured. So there's the public, that's your peace, that's the justification for your suffering. And at the same time, can you then withdraw in the back room and then have a piece of balancing it out and maybe reconciliation? So that seemed to be impossible. And that's a dimension also of public, not just media public, but also it's about symbolic policy. It's about public diplomacy that actually works into these societies. And I suppose it contributes, or it's one of the decisive factors why this peace was so short-lived and why it wasn't accepted, and that immediately after signing it in the early 20s. So maybe I could just, I can do it in 1 minute. I would give you a little anecdote about this. So I would like to add, so I had the privilege or the pleasure, so for the Federal Republic of Germany to participate in the Bosnia peace negotiations 1995 in Dayton. So the negotiating parties on the first day, they swore there would be zero press. So, and you were in the air base and there was no journalists anywhere, no access, so zero press. Nobody would be instructed beforehand. I also stuck to that, so up to a certain degree anyway. And then I found, however, that at the end of the second week, the process took 3 weeks in total, and in one evening I had the necessity to briefly talk to Richard Holbrooke, the American chief negotiator, and so without knocking I went in his room, in his office, and there we had someone from the New York Times sitting there. So I said afterwards, but why New York Times? I thought we didn't want to have any press here. So I want to shorten the story. So Holbrooke, knowing that it was violating our agreement, talked extensively with the New York Times because he believed, to fear that the result would possibly be received with less joy and enthusiasm in Washington, and that with a press representation you could push it in the right direction. So what do I want to say? So the press is in these cases not just a nuisance and maybe a necessary evil, but the press can of course also represent a great instrument, a great tool to actually support certain results if you give it a certain twist in the presentation. So, but of course you can see the press in the negative sense, that certain results are sabotaged and prevented and pushing them into another direction. So it's not just, you can't do it without the press, and I think that if today in modern diplomacy Trump uses Twitter, so I believe that what he does is top-down diplomacy, so for most cases it's wrong.
Well, we have to sort of be brief. Well, in the case of North Korea, I think it would be much wiser if emissaries would talk to one another, who are well-skilled, well-trained. I mean, this top-down diplomacy, including the tweets, that is something where Trump could never really show that this works successfully. Now, of course, you have to talk about China. China was a party to Versailles. I think they'd send workers who held in Shaanxi, and that is why the Chinese were considered a victorious power, and they had high hopes. They came to Versailles with high hopes because they wanted to have Shantung back. Shantung at that time was a German colony, and the colonies were taken away, and the Chinese would think, well, it's a German colony and it goes back to us, but then it ended up with Japan. For the Chinese, that was a brutal disappointment, and as I have read, that has repercussions until the present day. That was the moment where China lost the fundamental trust in Western Europe. They'd never trust them again as being reliable. What do you think is the long-term effect of that? There's several lines. The humiliation, the disappointment of 1919 was enormous, and immediately that led to massive national protests. The unrest of the 4th of May 1919, the beginning of the modern Chinese history as a history of reactive delimitation against the West, complete discreditation of Wilson and his ideas. Shantung is a good example. It shows the Chinese, including the young Mao, that the North is racist and the North is against the right of self-determination. You'll just look at power interests when it comes to the Asian Pacific region, and they articulated conditions that left no space at all for the legitimate Chinese interest. So that was the self-isolation against the West, against the United States. And this is a kind of national humiliation that is still present on the minds of the people. 4 years ago, I had the pleasure of participating in the International Historians Conference for the first time. It took place in China, and it took place quite deliberately in Jinan, the capital of Shantung, and every Chinese official in his or her speech talked about 1919. So it has a historical long-term effect. It has effects on how the self-awareness is identified today based on the experience of humiliation in 1919. The League of Nations, that was an attempt at setting up a multilateral structure, but it failed. The United Nations then was the second attempt. A professor from Singapore, politologist, says if the West is serious about multilateralism, then they would take the General Assembly of the United Nations seriously, and because he said that's the parliament of the world and it should not be dominated by the West. What would you say? Would that be the right way to go forward? I think the right way, indeed, is to have a resolve of the West, including the non-permanent member of the Security Council, Germany, to tackle a reform of the United Nations. I think we should really stand up for reform of the United Nations, and we should not see that just in the light of whether there is a right, there is a claim for Germany's membership as a permanent Security Council member. That was a question that always was discussed in German foreign policy, and I think it's not about Germany's permanent presence, it's not about Germany's constant membership, it's about the question of can we really reform the Security Council so that it can no longer be blocked? Can we render the United Nations more capable of taking actions? Then we have the question of enlargement. Why is India, why is Japan, why is Brazil not a member of the Security Council, at least not on a permanent basis? Yes, I think it is a very important goal. Unfortunately, we have only one organization as the United Nations. And I do not see any chance to create something new and better, so we better take what we have and reform it. So our German support for reform of the United States would be not more credible if we do not link it to a German claim to be a permanent Security Council member. That would be unrealistic. Now we hand over to our audience. Thank you for this very fascinating conversation. Mr. Ischinger, you said we do not know where the Americans are going to go. Now let's say they withdraw from Europe. What would be the three most important prerequisites that need to be fulfilled for us Europeans to have a chance to develop a robust system, security system for our continent? Well, the way things are at the moment, the prerequisite for us to build a security system, to be able to defend ourselves, defend our interests and have security, I do not see such an opportunity in the foreseeable future. I think, like many others, that we have to do everything we can in order to avoid a total withdrawal of the United States. There is no substitute for the Northern Atlantic Alliance, and that includes the nuclear issue. I don't see kind of alternative. Having said this, let me also add the following. Of course, it would be a good idea to think about the areas we have in Europe where we can become stronger, where we can make a stronger contribution. I'm not talking about the 2% defense budget, but we do have European nuclear powers as well. So the question of what will happen in the long-term future, maybe we could imagine a mid to long-term future where we have our nuclear protection for this case where the US is no longer willing to play the classical Article 5 role in NATO. It's a legitimate issue. We should discuss it, but we shouldn't be clear about the perspective. We are talking about things that would take a generation and more. On a short-term basis, I think we should do everything we can on a political level in order to keep the US as a European power. This, by the way, was also something that Richard Holbrooke said in 1993 in an article to a journal, the United States as a European power. We should succeed in keeping the American interested in remaining a European power. That would be a big success. Christopher Marshall from Tagesspiegel. The Peace Accord of Paris. Let's take this title and let's look at it in a different light, namely the end of the Cold War. The Charter of Paris, a major issue was the freedom to choose an alliance, the sovereignty, the acceptance, the end of accepting spheres of influence at the detriment of the countries. I'm really torn. Having been to Moscow, I was in Moscow now for a couple of days, and I'm really shocked that all people there, including intellectuals, look at the map and these spheres of influence. What is the reason? Maybe we didn't make concessions enough to the Russians, or maybe we have forgotten our principle. We have not defended our principle. Of course, it goes without saying that the Russians don't like the way in which things developed in Europe after 1990. But the question is, do we do enough in order to defend our principles in Europe? And maybe it would be a good idea to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Hitler-Stalin pacts in Germany by inviting the Russians and and having a historical conference on that. That would include the Central and East European, Southeast European states. I mean, that's the dilemma we had after 1990. And yesterday we had a long debate about it in the evening. We talked about the great powers, including Germany. We wanted to set up a stable and sustainable European and international order, and yesterday we didn't speak much about the states of Central Eastern Europe, the Baltic states and the Southeast European states. We didn't look at their perspective, we didn't look at their legitimate interests, and their interests were not seen in a proper light after 1990. I do not always want to draw parallels, but the dynamism of liberation from imperial rule after 1990 in Central and Eastern Europe would give rise to questions, to powers and forces that needed to be taken into account. And I'm not so sure whether we recognize that and whether we did enough to create stability. And here I do not just have in mind NATO and EU integration.
I wanted to make a short comment on something you said, which is concerning Syria. I understood that you were saying that the West had committed an error or a miscalculation by calling for regime change. And I think that it seems to me that that is a short version of events, and it reduces actually the reality of what happened. Just to remind perhaps everybody that Syrians had been demonstrating in thousands for months, from mid-March 2015, for months, and started being shot at by Assad's army before Obama, Merkel, and who was it, Hollande, made a joint statement at the end of August 2011 saying Assad must go. And the reason the Western leaders waited those few months is that they weren't rushing for regime change. They were hoping that Erdogan would push Assad towards introducing reforms which would end this crisis situation. Regime change was not wished upon Syria by Western leaders at all. They were basically trying to catch up or, act in showing some kind of understanding of what Syrian citizens had been demonstrating for. And my question is, so I think we need to be careful with quick formulas about regime change, because that echoes still today among disinformation networks, and also it echoes in the sense that people might make a quick comparison with Iraq.
Your question, please.
Syria, we did not do anything basically about Syria. And my question is, would you say, because we're talking about the international security architecture, and we're thinking about the Society of Nations, would you say that our international security architecture, the way we knew it up until not too long ago, actually collapsed in Syria? All the international norms, UN norms, international conventions, prohibition of chemical weapon use, humanitarian international law, so many rules that we thought would allow us to uphold never again, actually collapsed in the vortex of the Syrian drama. And I'm mentioning it I want to mention this today because right now, as we're sitting here, dramatic events are unfolding in Idlib, which could potentially have an impact on our part of the world. And the Syrian collapse of international norms and our failure to prevent that also preceded the collapse of Europe's security architecture in Ukraine. Would you agree with me that the Syrian situation is actually the vortex of our situation today with the collapse of international UN-constructed international norms, like the Society of Nations?
That's a very long question.
But you need a short answer.
And I'll try to give you a very short answer. I don't think I can fully agree with what you say. The fact is and remains that our leaders, including certain German leaders, joined in the chorus saying Assad must go. Now, I don't care whether you call that regime change or not, but that was a fact. And I'm not actually criticizing it, because I do agree that horrible things were happening. But if you say this as a government or as a bunch of governments and then don't do a thing about it, just stand aside waiting for others to do things, then that is what I call irresponsible international behavior. So I accuse our governments, the West, of inaction. I don't, if they had been serious about it, they could have easily prevented this larger, terrible conflict if they had started to work together early and get involved in the conflict when it was still civil strife, and not, the world's most capable terrorists coming together in Syria to create the kind of a catastrophe which we have now experienced for the last number of years. So I criticize, the fact that we said something and then didn't act on it. That's bad policy.
So, jetzt die Dame hier vorne in der zweiten Reihe.
Now the lady over there, and then the gentleman on the other side of the room. And you come last. I've got a question regarding the Paris peace order. Today, aggression looks different. Usually we do not see a fully fledged war, but we have manipulations, we have cyber attacks. Here I think diplomacy must act, and here my question goes to both of you. What can diplomacy do? How can diplomats take action? Could they negotiate new treaties, new agreements today to, for instance, prohibit cyber attacks? Is that possible, and how should such an agreement look like? If we don't do anything, it seems to me we are going to live in a reality where we are going to live in a situation that is neither war nor peace. Very briefly, diplomacy, foreign policy is a learning system. And Paris 1990 shows that diplomacy and international policy did not have the cognitive ability to do something in a situation of a revolution and a war of mass destruction. They couldn't make peace with traditional instruments. Diplomacy as a learning system. In Paris, it has failed 1919 because it was not able, for lack of time, and since there was such a big pressure after the war, to come to terms with the challenges of setting up a peace under new and modern conditions.
So I would just briefly want to add, because it was a question to us both. So the wars, conflict, indeed, for the last 900 years, it was generated by kinetic energy, using kinetic energy. So, but now we're moving in a situation where, indeed, hybrid situations actually occur. So maybe they don't even shoot, as the power of one of the other, the dominating the one through the other, using other means than kinetic energy. You mentioned cyber, manipulation of facts, influencing large majorities of population with means that were not available at the time of the Versailles Agreement. Sure. Diplomacy, however, also needs to deal with the new forms and shapes. I don't see any reason, no general reason, why it shouldn't be possible, for instance, to take cyber norms and then agree on them internationally, like in other areas. So it's more difficult than areas where you can actually see whether a projectile has actually hit that wall or not. But it is not totally impossible, and that's something we should try to attempt. Brief question. Yes, brief question. The Syrian conflict has a lot to do with drought, with a land flight in Syria and due to the climate-induced conditions. And my question to Mr. Ischinger is, in New World Peace Order, what role would climate protection play? Because it seems to be absent here. So there's migration movement triggered by that climate change. So just briefly, so I mean, time's running out. So we've got, so this year, after a lot of consideration and also long hesitation, so we've got the issue of climate and security. So for the first time in 55 years, the Munich Security Conference has been around for 55 years. This has been added to the main program of the conference. So Professor Schellenhuber, who is located in Potsdam, he gave us a dramatic appeal. That's the first part of my, second part of my answers. Also in the Munich Security Conference, there's a number of earlier decision makers, so Madeleine Albright, Carl Bildt from Sweden, and others. I personally as well. We we signed adopted a declaration of principle and introduced this, which you can read up. You can Google this, with the principles for a future world order. So everything which is good, like self-determination to non-influence and peaceful arbitration of conflicts, as well as climate. So you will find that in fundamental documents and appeals like adopted 10, 20 or 30 years ago, that you don't find the issue of climate. I mean, first of all, yes, you're right. Climate needs to be added to the determinants of a future-oriented peace and stability policy. Have we got time for one more question, or do we need to briefly? Mr. Ischinger, can you imagine any constellation where Russia and Ukraine enter into a certain peace agreement and agree on the status of Crimea? And I can't imagine this. And are we not actually in a hybrid situation, as you say, when we have to learn to live with such unresolved conflicts? And diplomacy is not just a learning, but also a forgetting system then, for structural reasons. Well, you know, the Germans, so in diplomacy, in the history of diplomacy since the Second World War, have learned one thing. At least this is what I claim for myself, and that is, when a problem is not, it doesn't seem to be able to be solved, then we will not forget it, but we'll just put it aside, so without forgetting it. So that was the method with which the question about the future of the two German states was treated in the 70s. Was elegantly ruled out. So both German countries or states were included in the United Nations. So it's possible with clever and smart diplomacy we can achieve a lot. And second and last point I would say is, if there's one optimistic lesson from the German history of the past years and decades, then it's the insight into international relations. There's nothing that is not impossible. And of course, theoretically, it's possible. So it's if you ask me if it's probable, I would say rather no, but theoretically nothing is impossible. That there's an agreement between Russia and Ukraine. So I think it's desirable. We Germans have made the experience that we've got the reunification of Germany. We thought it was practically, so at least we didn't think it was doable within our lifetime. And then we had it. And so maybe in a few years we might be surprised by a peace accord between Moscow and Kiev. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, thank you very much. We had a good discussion. Thank you for coming.